The night sky above the Georgian countryside in 1866 carried no stars, only a smothering blanket of ash-colored clouds that pressed low upon the earth like a shroud. And in that silence, broken only by the croak of unseen frogs and the distant howl of dogs on chains, a house still stood, its timbers creaking, its windows unlit, as if holding its breath against some impending doom. A doom that history would later claim came not from fire or storm, but from the lips of a boy who had learned to name what should never have been named. Neighbors would speak of the child in whispers, calling him quiet, peculiar, his gaze too fixed, too knowing for his age. They said his name was Malachi Harlan, the youngest son of a once prominent family whose fortunes had withered in the aftermath of the war, his father limping from an old wound, his mother worn thin by grief and hunger. Yet none of that seemed to weigh on Malachi, for he carried himself with a strange composure, as though guided by something unseen. And when he spoke, rarely as he did, people leaned closer, not out of fondness, but out of unease, sensing there was something foreign in the rhythm of his words. It was the parish pastor who first remarked upon the boy's odd practice. Malachi, he said, had a habit of standing in the back of the church graveyard after sermons, not to pray, but to whisper, as though conversing with someone beneath the soil. And though the pastor once drew near, hoping to catch a phrase, he recoiled at the guttural syllables spilling from the boy's mouth, sounds that did not resemble English nor Latin, but some fractured tongue that made the hairs rise on his arms, and he swore he heard the earth itself shift faintly, as if stirred in reply. Within a week of that discovery, the Harlan home became a place avoided by children, even by grown men. For each night, a candle burned in Malachi's window. Though no match had been struck, its flame steady against the draughts, burning blue rather than gold, and strange laughter, high and echoing, could sometimes be heard leaking through the shutters, laughter that did not belong to any boy, nor to any man. And then, 7 nights after he was first seen speaking names among the gravestones, the house turned to ash, not by natural fire, not by lightning or lantern, but in a silence so complete the neighbors claimed they only smelled smoke after the ruin was already finished. At dawn, when the neighbors finally dared to cross the fields, they found only a blackened skeleton of the Harlan home, its beams collapsed inward, its hearth cold and fractured. Yet there was no smell of wood smoke lingering in the air, only an acrid sting like scorched iron and salt, as if the very soil had been burned. The chickens in the yard lay stiff and lifeless, their bodies untouched by flame, their eyes clouded white as if boiled from within. The family dog lay at the threshold, jaws locked open as though mid-scream, and no sign of the Harlans themselves could be found. No bodies, no bones, not even the smallest trace. Whispers carried fast through the valley. Some claimed the family had perished, consumed so completely that nothing remained. Others swore they had been taken, pulled away into the shadows by the very things Malachi had named. And though the local sheriff rode out, inspecting the ruin with a grim face, he too admitted the evidence defied reason. He muttered that no ordinary fire left soil scorched to glass. No ordinary fire devoured a house, but left the pasture fence standing untouched, as though a hand of precision had carved out one square of reality and erased it from existence. The parish pastor, trembling, declared it a judgment from God. He insisted that sin had taken root in the Harlan bloodline, and that the boy Malachi was its cursed fruit. Yet others whispered of darker possibilities, recalling old slave tales of children born with eyes too clear, too knowing, children marked to serve as vessels for voices older than Scripture, voices chained by silence until called by name. Among the wreckage, a single object remained intact, a journal, its cover charred, but its pages mostly whole, discovered lodged between stones of the foundation. The sheriff carried it into town, but after reading only a handful of entries, he sealed it away. Claim. Inget's words were nonsense, yet those who glimpsed a page before he hid it swore the writing was not nonsense but a list of names, names written in ink that glistened as if wet, shifting upon the page like crawling insects, names no one could read aloud without choking, as though the letters themselves fought against being spoken. And so the ruin stood, black and hollow against the horizon, while the town whispered that the boy had not been consumed. No, he had been claimed, and that those who dared speak his name in turn risked calling down what he had called up. The town of Fairhaven, tucked deep in the Georgia pines, had always regarded the Harlan family with wary respect, for though they were neither the wealthiest nor the most prominent, their name carried an old weight, one that seemed older than the red clay their farm was built upon, older even than the church that rose from its hills. The Harlans were said to have settled the land before proper surveyors ever reached these valleys, guided, according to rumor, not by compass nor star, but by voices in the woods, voices that drew their wagons to a patch of earth where the soil was unusually dark, rich as spilled blood, and there they built their homestead. Some said Malachi's great-grandfather, Silas Harlan, had come from the mountains of Virginia carrying strange books wrapped in oilskin, books never shown to others, and a habit of walking the fields at night whispering into the wind. The crops grew taller under his hand, though the animals grew nervous around him, refusing to graze in certain corners of the pasture. When he died, his coffin was found half empty, as if the body had shrunk within it, leaving only bones too small for the man he once was, and the preacher at that time muttered that the family should never have laid claim to that land, for something in the earth was claiming them in return. By Malachi's birth, the war had torn much of Georgia apart, men broken and fields left barren, but neighbors swore the Harlan's corn stood taller than any other, their hens laid even through the hard winters, and their well water never ran dry. Though no one saw Malachi's father laboring as hard as the rest, whispers suggested that blessings had been bought with words not meant for human mouths, bought with names remembered in shadows. The boy himself was quiet, thin, his skin pale as chalk, his eyes grey with a peculiar clarity. He rarely played with the other sea. Hildren, preferring to sit near the roots of the great oak by the edge of their field, speaking softly into the hollow beneath its trunk, and though his mother called it childish imagination, those who overheard claimed the boy was not speaking in any language they knew, the syllables stretched and broken, carrying a rhythm more like chanting than play. It was there, under that tree, that the first true whispers began, for children swore they heard the ground reply to him, not with words but with sighs, a shifting of roots, a groan of soil that seemed to breathe. It was said the first time Malachi revealed his secret gift was not before his parents, nor before the pastor, but before another boy, a neighbor's son named Caleb. The two had wandered into the pasture at dusk, fireflies blinking in the air like watchful eyes. Caleb dared him to climb the oak and leap from its lowest branch, but Malachi only shook his head, his gaze fixed instead on the hollow beneath the roots, where shadows pooled darker than the evening sky. He knelt close to the earth, pressing his lips to the soil as though speaking into a mouth. And when he rose, he whispered to Caleb with a calm so unnatural that it silenced the cicadas. He said, "Do you want to hear a name?" Caleb laughed, thinking it a game, and nodded. But when Malachi leaned in and spoke a string of sounds that scraped like iron against bone, Caleb staggered back, clutching his ears. The air itself seemed to shiver, and a smell like sulphur rolled over the pasture. The shadows beneath the oak stretched outward, writhing as though stirred by some unseen wind. Caleb swore he heard laughter rise from the roots, laughter too large, too deep for any child to summon. He turned and fled, and though he never spoke of it openly again, his mother remarked that he woke screaming each night for weeks, insisting that something was calling him by name from under the floorboards. From that day forward, Malachi's isolation grew. Children crossed the road to avoid him. Adults spoke his name in lowered tones, yet the boy himself seemed unbothered. If anything, he grew more intent, carrying a small leather notebook into which he scribbled lines no one could decipher. Jagged strokes, spirals, and names. Always names. Written in letters that curved like hooks and burned into memory, even when glimpsed in passing. Livestock began to fall ill, not with disease, but with something stranger. Their eyes clouded white, their bodies stiff as though listening to a sound beyond human hearing. And each time one died, Malachi was seen standing near, murmuring softly, his breath visible even in the heat of summer. The family tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Yet in the town, whispers grew that the boy was practicing something older than Scripture, older than the soil beneath his feet. And as the pastor would later confess in secret, the names he spoke were not only heard, they were answered. The journal appeared without announcement. One evening, Malachi walked into town with his father's wagon, selling eggs and flour as usual. Yet when he returned, a book rested in his satchel, bound in cracked leather, its edges worn, as if it had passed through 100 hands before finding his. No one in Fairhaven's little store remembered selling it to him, though the shopkeeper's wife recalled a stranger visiting that very day. A pale man in a black coat who spoke little and paid in silver coins dulled with age. After he departed, the boy carried the journal everywhere, tucking himself away beneath the oak or in the ruined barn behind the house, scribbling furiously with a stub of pencil until his fingers stained dark with graphite. Those who caught a glimpse said the book was filled not with essays or childish sketches, but rows of names, some half familiar, twisted into forms that looked more like wounds than letters, others entirely alien, curved and broken symbols that left an ache in the eyes. If studied too long, the boy seemed to treat the pages not as memory, but as invocation, as though the very act of writing fixed something in place, gave weight to whispers that would otherwise scatter on the wind. The parish pastor, Reverend Calloway, began to take notice. His sermons grew more urgent, warning against the corruption of tongues not sanctioned by God. He recalled seeing Malachi at the back of the churchyard again, his lips moving in rhythm with the ringing of the bell. Yet the words did not align with hymn or Scripture. They dripped heavy as tar, carrying syllables that seemed to bruise the air. The Reverend confronted him once, laying a hand upon the boy's shoulder, demanding to know what he was speaking. But when Malachi turned his gaze upon him, grey eyes pale as winter ash, the Reverend faltered, for in that instant he felt a weight settle in his chest, as though the boy had named him silently, and his breath came short. He stumbled back, gasping, unable to speak until the boy looked away. That night, the Reverend locked himself in his study, tearing through Scripture by candlelight, searching for lines of binding and banishment, yet none seemed to answer the dread he had felt, for this was not possession nor blasphemy, but something colder, older, as if language itself had been turned against him. And outside, Malachi wrote still, his pencil scratching names that should not have been remembered. It was Malachi's sister, Ruth, who first confessed that the journal unsettled her. She was only 12, timid and prone to night terrors, yet when she entered her brother's room to gather laundry, she swore she heard the pages whispering, as if the ink itself had not yet dried. Moving faintly like water beneath skin, she told her mother that the book made her teeth ache, that when she glanced at the letters, they seemed to twitch in the corner of her vision, as though eager to be read aloud. Her mother dismissed it, though uneasily, for she too had begun to notice changes in the house. The windows rattled though no storm passed. Shadows lingered longer than flame should allow. The walls gave small groans, as though shifting to hear better. And once, in the silence before dawn, Ruth swore she heard her brother's voice in the hallway, repeating a single name over and over. Yet when she rose to check, his door was shut tight, his voice continuing from inside, calm and steady, though she could not recognize the syllables, not English, not prayer, but something that scratched at the inside of her ears. Their father, weary from war and drink, dismissed the talk as childish nerves, yet even he grew wary when the animals began to refuse the barn, the cows bellowing, straining against their ropes until their hides bled, the horse refusing to cross the threshold, eyes rolling white. It was as if something unseen had already claimed the rafters and beams, and the house, once warm with hearthlight, began to feel hollow, echoing, as though each corner contained more space than it should. Too much room for voices to hide. One evening, Ruth attempted to take the journal from her brother's desk, determined to throw it into the fire. Yet the moment her fingers touched the leather, she froze, her limbs stiff as wood, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes watering as though invisible hand. Dee's pressed against her chest, and then Malachi's voice behind her, calm but edged with a chill. He said, "Do not touch what is not yours." And though his words were quiet, the house itself seemed to repeat them in groans of timber and rustling rafters. From that night forward, the family no longer entered his room uninvited, for it no longer belonged entirely to him. It belonged to the names he had written inside. Fairhaven had always been a quiet settlement, a patchwork of farmhouses and dirt lanes where gossip spread quicker than smoke. Yet in the months after Malachi's return, something changed. Neighbours began to whisper of unease that hung over the Harlan land like a fog. Children complained of strange shapes crossing their windows at night, though no one stood outside. Dogs barked furiously at the road that led past the Harlan fence but refused to step onto the property. Even hunters who had walked those woods all their lives claimed the forest had grown foreign, paths bending where none should, old oaks seeming to lean closer as if to listen. The journal's influence was not spoken of, for only the family knew of its presence. Yet its reach stretched into Fairhaven like a shadow. One Sunday at the small clapboard church, when the Reverend called upon the congregation to repeat a simple psalm, 3 voices faltered at once, their tongues thick, the words twisted into something unholy, not mockery but intrusion, as though another voice had joined the prayer through them, their faces pale, eyes fixed as if watching something no one else could see. The service ended early, the congregation spilling into the yard in silence. That same week, Mrs. Dalton swore she found footprints in the soft earth beneath her window, but the prints were backward, the heel pointing out, the toes pressed toward the house. She asked her husband if he had gone out in the night. He had not, and when she returned the next day to show a neighbour, the tracks were gone, the ground smooth, as if the soil itself refused to remember. People began to avoid the Harland homestead, though none dared say why aloud. The blacksmith crossed himself when Malachi passed by, though he tried to disguise it as scratching his beard. Mothers kept their children from playing near the road, and when asked they simply said, "Be," as to leave the boy be. He has seen too much of war. Yet beneath those words was the sharper fear that war was not what haunted him now. At night, the lanterns in the Harlan house burned longer than any others, strange flickering glows shifting against the upstairs windows, as though more than one shadow moved within, and the town, though silent, knew in its bones that the boy had brought something back from beyond the graves he dug. The entries no longer read like memories of the battlefield. They pulsed, alive, with a rhythm that Malachi could feel in his bones. When he turned the pages, the ink swam before his eyes, reforming into commands, short phrases that demanded action rather than reflection. Bring earth from the graves, let blood touch the roots, speak the names aloud. At first he resisted, telling himself that these were tricks of exhaustion. But the longer he stared, the more the words seemed to burn, until to disobey felt more painful than to comply. One night he carried a lantern into the woods, shovel slung across his back, the journal pressed to his chest like scripture. He stopped at a stand of birch trees and dug until his palms blistered. The pages instructed him to bury the bone he had once carried from a battlefield, a fragment he had taken without thinking, a souvenir of war. Now the journal insisted it belonged to the earth again. He pressed it deep into the soil, and when the dirt closed over it, the wind stilled, as though the forest itself had inhaled. From that night on the dreams returned, no longer fleeting images of trenches, but voices, calling him by name, voices of men he had known and buried. Yet their mouths did not form prayers, they formed numbers, sequences he did not understand. He awoke sweating, the journal open on his chest. Though he had left it on the table, each new page already filled in a hand that was not his. He began to notice that his mother's health waned whenever the journal demanded more, a cough clinging to her chest, her eyes growing dim as if the house itself drained her. His father grew irritable, pacing at night, muttering that he heard scratching in the walls. But whenever Malachi went to look, there was nothing, only the faint thrum of the journal waiting upstairs. The instructions escalated: kill the crows that gathered near the fence, scat, tear their blood at the doorstep, Carve the symbol of the twisted root into the wood of the barn. He obeyed with trembling hands, ashamed yet compelled, knowing that each act pulled him deeper, and each time the air around the homestead grew heavier, pressing on the lungs of anyone who dared approach. And still, in the empty hours before dawn, he felt watched, not only by the journal, but by something it had invited, something patient that fed on obedience. It began with the animals. The farmers muttered first about cows refusing to give milk, then about sheep that would not graze, then about dogs that stared for hours at the forest line, growling at shadows that never took form. The elders blamed the late frost. The younger men blamed sickness in the soil. But none could explain why the church bells, rung for Sunday Mass, sounded cracked and hollow, their notes dull as if swallowed by unseen fog. Children, restless at night, cried out about a man without eyes watching from the hedges. Their mothers hushed them, but glanced toward the fields with unease. Candles burned lower than usual, melting into pools of wax within an hour. Bread went mouldy though baked fresh that morning, and every well seemed to carry a faint taste of iron. Though no rust could be found in the buckets, it was as though something unseen crept from the woods into every home. When neighbors gathered, they spoke in careful tones. No one wanted to name fear too loudly, yet they all had the same impression, that the town was being measured, weighed by a presence they could not see. Farmers swore they heard their own names whispered in the wind. Blacksmiths claimed their hammers rang with hollow echoes. Though the iron was sound, the priest doubled his prayers, adding midnight vigils. Yet the pews remained empty, the faithful preferring the risk of silence over the risk of gathering where the air grew so thick. What none of them knew was that Malachi, under orders from the journal, had carved a symbol beneath the altar, his trembling hands tracing lines by lantern light, the mark darkening as though drinking from the wood itself. When the congregation sat above it, they did not realize they were sitting inside a snare, every whispered hymn feeding the thing that had claimed Malachi. At night, smoke lingered above chimneys, long after the fire should have died. The shapes drifted through it, twisting like bodies caught in slow motion. Those who saw them told no one, fearful they would be thought mad. Yet in silence the terror grew, and silence was exactly what the journal craved, because silence was obedience, and Malachi, though he never spoke of what he had done, knew that the town's unease was not separate from his hands, but tied directly to them, as if each ritual act had stitched another thread of their lives into the dark net that bound him. He arrived one grey morning when the mist clung low to the cobblestones, his boots caked with mud from roads no local had travelled, his coat heavy, stitched with patches of foreign cloth, and his face weathered like old leather, the kind of man who seemed less a visitor than a messenger dragged by necessity. He asked no directions, no blessings. He simply walked to the church and stopped before its doors as though he had always known where he must go. The townsfolk noticed him instantly, their suspicion sharpened by weeks of unease. Who was he? Why had he come? And why did his right hand bear a scar that twisted across the palm in the same jagged curve Malachi had carved beneath the altar? No one but Malachi should have recognized it. Yet even those who had never seen the mark felt a sickness stir when they caught sight of the scar, as though their bones remembered something their minds refused to name. He spoke little, introducing himself only as Elias, his voice low, clipped, carrying the weight of someone long accustomed to grave matters. He asked for water, he asked for bread, but his eyes lingered not on the people who served him, rather on the church spire above. And each time the bells rang hollow, his jaw tightened, as if confirming some private suspicion. When he finally addressed the priest, it was not with humility but with warning. He asked if strange things had begun, if the earth tasted of iron, if the animals had gone restless. And when the priest faltered with half answers, Elias nodded grimly, saying only, "It is not yet too late if you listen." Malachi, standing nearby, felt his chest seize. The journal hidden beneath his bed seemed to burn against his memory. Elias's scar was the twin of his own hidden carving, and though Elias never looked at him directly, Malachi felt seen, as though his name had been written in the stranger's eyes long before tea. Hare meeting. That night the townsfolk whispered about the visitor. Some believed he was a wanderer of ill omen, others that he was a deliverer sent by God. But Malachi knew better. Elias had not come to save them. Elias had come because the thing in the woods had been awakened, and men like him only travelled where ancient debts were being collected. It was after the last bell had rung hollow through the dark, when the town lay heavy in silence, that Malachi felt the knock at his door. 3 deliberate raps, neither friendly nor impatient, but final. He knew before he opened it that Elias would be standing there, and when he lifted the latch, the stranger entered without asking, his presence filling the small room like smoke. Elias sat at the table without invitation, placing his scarred hand flat upon the wood, the mark glistening faintly in the lantern light. Malachi tried to speak, to explain, to defend, but Elias lifted his other hand for silence, his eyes cold, patient, as though he had heard every excuse before. "You've seen it," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "And worse, you've written it down." The words froze Malachi's throat. He had never spoken of the journal to another soul, not even to the priest. Yet Elias leaned forward, his voice low, each syllable sharp. "That which you recorded was not yours to bind in ink. It is an old thing, an older hunger, and names, when carved, when written, become doors." Malachi's heart thudded, his secret stripped bare. He stammered, I only meant to keep the memory, to understand." But Elias's expression did not soften. "Understanding is the first lie it tells," he murmured. "Every man believes he can hold its shape in words, but the words do not stay still. They grow teeth. They grow claws." The journal seemed to pulse in the back of Malachi's mind, tucked beneath his mattress upstairs. Though he had not touched it in days, he felt it yearning, pages restless, as if aware of their conversation. Elias must have sensed it too, for he turned his head slightly, as if listening to a faint echo no one else could hear. "You hear it at night, don't you? The scratching, the voices like roots tearing through soil." Malachi could only nod, the confession unspose. Ken but undeniable, Elias leaned closer, his whisper almost a hiss. "Then you must choose, boy. Burn it before it burns you, or keep it, and invite what follows." But even as Elias spoke, Malachi knew the choice was already beyond him, because deep inside, despite his fear, he did not want to destroy it. Some part of him needed the journal, needed the pull of the thing that had first whispered his name. That night, after Elias had gone, leaving only the smell of rain-soaked leather and candle wax behind, Malachi sat alone in his narrow room, the lantern flickering low, shadows crawling along the walls like insects. He told himself he would not touch the journal, not even glance at it, but the silence pressed against his ears until he thought he might go mad. And then the sound came, faint but sharp, like a quill scratching across paper, coming not from outside but from beneath his mattress. His breath caught. The journal was writing itself. He could hear it, each stroke of invisible ink carving into the page. Trembling, he pulled it free, and the leather binding felt warm, almost damp, as if it had been left too near a fire. When he opened it, the letters bled across the paper in black veins, curling, shifting, refusing to hold their shape. Lines of text that twisted until they formed his own name, over and over again. Malachi. 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 He tried to slam it shut, but the pages resisted, flaring open as though something inside drew breath. A whisper leaked from the cracks in the binding, faint at first, then clearer. "Do not fear the mark. Do not fear the blood. It is yours already." Malachi staggered back, nearly overturning the lantern, his hands trembling so violently he thought his bones might rattle apart, yet still his eyes dragged back to the page, unable to look away. And there, He saw a figure drawn in fresh black ink, crude yet unmistakable. It was Elias, the scar carved across his palm, his shoulders hunched as though bracing against an unseen wind. But as Malachi stared, the drawing shifted. Elias's ink eyes looked upward, and a new line scrawled itself beneath the figure, jagged and wet. "He carries the chain. He cannot cut it." The journal pulsed, its edges curling as if something inside sought release. Malachi dropped it onto the floor, but it lay, undid open, its pages turning as though stirred by breath. The whispering grew louder, a chorus now, layered, voices old and cracked, chanting words he did not know but somehow understood. Words of binding, words of hunger, words that called him by name and promised he had already chosen. And though fear rooted him in place, a terrible truth burned in his chest. He wanted to hear more. He wanted to follow the voices, to let them carve his name deeper into the living pages that no fire could consume. The storm broke at dawn, rain lashing the windows, wind groaning against the boards. Malachi had not slept, his body stiff from the chair where he sat staring at the journal lying on the floor. It had grown quiet again. No voices, no shifting ink, just stillness. But he knew it was waiting. He knew it breathed even now, though it masked itself in silence. When Elias returned, cloak dripping, boots muddy from the marsh track, his eyes immediately found the journal where it lay, the flicker in his gaze sharp, fearful, though he tried to bury it. "You opened it, didn't you?" Elias said flatly. Not a question, but a sentence. Malachi's throat tightened, his hands flexing as though to hide the tremor. "It wrote," he whispered. "It showed me you." Elias stiffened, his jaw tightening. He crossed the room in long strides and bent to lift the book. But the moment his hands touched the cover, he flinched, pulling back as though it had burned him. The journal twitched on the floor, a ripple through the leather like flesh recoiling. Elias cursed under his breath, pressing his scarred palm against his thigh. "It has gone too far," he said, voice low. "It should not have taken your name yet." Malachi's blood ran cold. "Yet?" he asked, but Elias ignored him, pacing, muttering words Malachi could not catch, fragments of Latin, fragments of prayers broken in half. Then suddenly Elias stopped and faced him, his face drawn, shadowed. "You must not answer it, no matter what it offers. If it speaks your name, you must close your ears. If it shows your face, you must blind yourself to the page. Once you answer, once you let it mark you, there is no return." The journal stirred again, the pages flapping as though caught in an unseen gust. A whisper slithered out, not to Malachi but to Elias, and for the first time Malachi saw the older man falter, his lips trembling as if resisting words he had sworn never to hear. His hand went to the scar on his palm, pressing it so hard blood welled fresh, dripping, pattering on the floorboards. "Do you see?" Elias rasped, his eyes fever bright. "It knows me. It calls me back. I thought I could guide you, but perhaps I was only leading you into its mouth." And then the journal spoke again, not in whispers, but in a voice that filled the room like thunder. "You are both already written." The words hung in the air like a sentence already passed. "You are both already written." Elias staggered back as though struck. Malachi pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding. The journal lay open on the floor, its pages turning of their own accord, faster and faster, until the blur of script became a whirlpool of ink, and from that whirlpool something began to rise. At first it was shadow, vague, shifting. But then the rain hammering against the window slowed, each drop suspended in mid-air like beads of glass. The wind froze in its howl. Silence heavy and crushing pressed down. Malachi realized with horror that the storm itself had been paused, not ended, but halted. Time held by the thing that was writing in their room. From the pages, faces surfaced, half-formed, mouths moving though no sound escaped, eyes hollow as if gouged by an unseen hand. Their features flickered, sometimes strangers, sometimes familiar, and once, Malachi's own reflection staring back at him with ink bleeding down its cheeks, he gasped and tried to look away. But the journal dragged his gaze back like a hook in the skull. Elias shouted something in a language older than the prayers Malachi knew, his voice booming with raw defiance. But the journal twisted his words, repeating them in mockery, louder, deeper, until they echoed from the walls, and the boards themselves began to warp, nails groaning as if the house despised the sound of defiance. The air thickened, the candle flames bending sideways, though there was no wind, shadows lengthening into claws that reached across the floorboards. One touched Malachi's boot, and the leather sizzled, smoke rising. He tore his foot away, stumbling, his chest heaving. "It's not just showing us," he whispered. "It's breaking through." Elias turned to him, face stark with grim resolve. This is what it does. This is how it feeds. It pulls the vision out until they're real, until you no longer know where the page ends and the world begins. And once you believe it, once you accept what it shows, then it is true forever. The journal's pages slowed, stopping on one entry written in thick strokes of ink that seemed to bleed fresh even as they watched. Malachi read the words, though he wished he hadn't, for they were not prophecy, they were command. Walk into the vision. Malachi's body betrayed him. His legs moved though his mind screamed to stay still, his boots scraping against the warped floorboards. Elias grabbed his arm, fingers digging in like iron. But the pull of the journal was stronger. It was not a pull like gravity. It was something deeper, like his soul was being threaded into the ink, strand by strand. The storm outside hung in silence, raindrops unmoving on the glass like trapped eyes, every sound stolen from the world except the rasp of the turning page. Malachi's hand reached forward, trembling, his skin pale in the dim light. His fingertips brushed the page and the ink surged, wet and living. Swallowing his hand up to the wrist, he screamed, but the sound was sucked inward, into the paper itself, leaving the room deafeningly still. Elias shouted his name, voice breaking, his other hand seizing Malachi's shoulder, trying to pull him back. But the journal did not resist with strength. It resisted with inevitability, like fighting against a river that had already decided its course. Malachi's arm sank deeper, past the elbow, his chest pressing toward the page, his vision flickering with symbols and faces that were not his own. And then with a sudden lurch he was through, not falling, but dragged, his body vanishing into the flat parchment as though the page had folded him in. Elias stumbled back, hands clutching at nothing, left staring at the open book where his brother's body had been swallowed whole. Malachi stood in a place that was not a place. The ground beneath him was not stone, not earth, but parchment stretched tight, endless and pale. Words moving beneath his feet like worms in soil, each step leaving behind prints that immediately filled with script, rewriting his very motion into the story. The air above was black ink dripping upward into an unseen sky. Ahead of him, the vision stretched. He saw the drowners. Figures from the journal walking in rows, their mouths sewn with stitches of ink, their movements jerky, mechanical, like puppets animated by some merciless hand. And beyond them loomed a cathedral of impossible architecture, doors wider than mountains, spires dissolving into smoke, its bells tolling in silence. Malachi's breath caught, his voice breaking into a whisper. "It's not a vision," he said. "It's a prison." And behind him, faint and muffled through the walls of reality, he heard Elias calling his name. But the journal whispered louder. "Do not go back." Malachi moved toward the cathedral, his boots sinking slightly into the parchment ground, as if each step carried weight far heavier than flesh. The drowned figures did not look at him. They shuffled past in rows, their bodies fragile, translucent, as though made of wet vellum, their stitched mouths whispering without sound, their eyeless faces turned always toward the cathedral doors. The doors themselves loomed higher than any mountain he could imagine, carved not from wood or iron, but from pages layered thick, the scripts of 1,000 languages, sentences half-finished, prayers cut off, screams frozen in curling ink. As he neared, the doors trembled, quivering like muscle, as though they could breathe. He pressed a hand to them and felt warmth. Not the warmth of life, but the heat of fever, the pulsing of veins beneath parchment. And with the faintest push, the doors yawned open. The drowned figures marched inside, their heads bent, their bodies folding forward like offerings. Inside the cathedral, the air was thicker, heavy as tar. The walls stretched higher than his sight could reach, endless shelves climbing the spires, each filled not with books, but with bodies flattened into pages, men, women, children, their limbs pressed into inked sheets, faces stretched in silent screams, each page flickering faintly, as if trying to breathe through the suffocating parchment. And in the center of the cathedral, upon an altar taller than a house, sat a throne of quills, broken pens, and shattered type. Upon it rested a figure cloaked in binding leather, faceless, but crowned with a circlet of dangling letters, shifting endlessly between alphabets. Its hands were not hands, but endless quills dripping black, each droplet falling and giving birth to another line of text upon the floor. Malachi froze, his heart stuttering as the figure's head tilted toward him, though no eyes were there to see. The silence broke with a sound like tearing paper, a voice whispering into him rather than around him. "You are not a reader. You are an addition." And suddenly he understood. The drowned figures, the pressed bodies, the shelves stacked to heaven. This cathedral was not a place of worship. It was a library, not built to preserve stories, but to preserve people. Every soul who had dared to open the journal, trapped and rewritten until nothing of themselves remained. Malachi staggered backward, bile rising in his throat, whispering, "This isn't vision, it's harvest." And the faceless figure lifted one quill hand toward him, beckoning him closer. The faceless figure did not move from its throne, but the cathedral itself bent with its gesture, the quills in its hand scratching the air, though no parchment lay before it. Yet lines appeared across Malachi's arms, dark strokes of living ink etching themselves beneath his skin. He gasped, clutching at the marks, but his fingers only smeared them, spreading faster across his body like veins. His veins were no longer red. He saw them glow faintly black beneath his flesh, pulsing as if filled with liquid night. The drowned figures stopped their march and turned in unison toward him, their eyeless sockets now filled with faint letters, letters that twisted and rearranged until they formed fragments of his own name. Malachi staggered, feeling a pressure in his head. Not pain, but intrusion. Words slithering behind his eyes, rewriting the memories he thought were his own. Scenes from his childhood flickered, but they were wrong. The tree outside their farmhouse had never bled when climbed. The face of his mother had not been bound with stitches, yet in this rewriting it was truth. The figure's voice seeped into him, smooth as ink across a page. "You do not remember. You are remembered. And now, rewritten." Outside, Elias felt it before he saw it. The journal on the table trembled, its pages fluttering though no wind touched them, and his brother's name, scrawled faintly in ink across the first page, began to fade, letter by letter. Elias's hands clamped down on the book, shouting, "No, no, you're not taking him! He's mine! He's here!" His voice cracked, desperation rising like a storm, but the ink only spread faster. Inside, Malachi screamed, his voice cracking not with pain, but with the horror of being hollowed, every memory stripped and overwritten with false lines, his sense of self unraveling into sentences, the faceless figure leaning closer, whispering without lie. Sates, ink does not remember. Ink replaces. Malachi fell to his knees, clutching his head as his thoughts turned to liquid, dripping down into the cathedral floor where they were absorbed like spilled script. But in that instant, a faint tug, a pull from outside, Elias's voice cutting through the dark chorus, Not a command, not a plea, but a raw scream of his name. Malachi, remember me. And for a split second, one letter in his name, the final I flared against the ink and refused to fade. Elias clutched the journal so hard his knuckles split, blood smearing across the fragile pages. The ink inside was alive now, writhing like snakes, twisting against his grip, trying to shut itself, but he slammed his hand flat against the open parchment and shouted his brother's name again. The room shook, candles flared, and for an instant he felt the tug of resistance loosen. Inside the cathedral, Malachi gasped as the black script clawing through his skin slowed, his chest heaving. The single burning eye in his name pulsing like a heart, tethered to something beyond the cathedral walls. The drowned figures froze in mid-step, their eyeless sockets swiveling toward the unseen sound, toward Elias's desperate cry that had slipped through stone and shadow. The faceless figure turned, not in surprise but in irritation, its form rippling, the ink quills in its hands snapping into jagged blades. "The tether holds because you call him," it whispered, though its voice reached Elias as well, echoing in the farmhouse, filling his ears with cold. "But call too long, and you will be written into him, drowned in the same page." The journal bucked under Elias's palms, forcing itself closed with a violence that cracked the table. But Elias threw his whole weight against it, veins bulging as he roared. "Then drown me too, but not without him." His blood seeped into the paper, staining the corner where Malachi's name had nearly vanished, and the crimson spread like an anchor, holding the last letter in place. The cathedral itself responded with fury, its vast walls groaning, chains rattling, pews splintering as if struck by invisible storms, dust cascaded from the ceiling. The drowned congregation began to shriek, a noise like parchment tearing mixed with water rushing. Malachi staggered to his feet, clutching at his chest where the burning eye pulsed. He could feel Elias's hand, no, it on his flesh, but on his existence, pulling, dragging. The faceless figure extended its ink blades, stabbing them down into the floor, and the cathedral groaned as jagged fissures of black light split the stone. "No one leaves once inscribed," it hissed, its faceless head bending impossibly close to Malachi. "You are mine to erase, and your brother dares to ink himself upon my page." And then Elias felt it, something cold sliding up his wrist from the journal, not pulling the book from him, but pulling him in, his reflection rippling in the wet ink, as though the page was a black pool waiting to swallow him whole. Elias's hand sank into the page as if the paper had melted into water, his fingers disappearing past the surface, cold gripping him like chains dragging his bones. He tried to pull back, but the journal would not release him. It clung like a hungry mouth, and he knew this was not theft, but invitation. The cathedral had turned its fury into a door. His reflection rippled in the black pool, features bending, stretching, eyes hollowing. The face that stared back was not his, but one stripped of will, a future written in ink. Yet behind the distortion he caught a glimpse. Malachi, standing in the cathedral, one knee bent, chest burning with that single letter. Elias realized the book was not just pulling him in, it was aligning them, synchronizing blood and ink until they shared the same page. The farmhouse around him shook, rafters groaning, window glass shattering inward as a wind unlike any storm roared from the journal. Elias gritted his teeth, shoved his other hand in, both arms swallowed to the elbow. His blood dripping into the ink now hissed like fire on water. The smell of scorched iron filled the air. Malachi staggered, his own skin splitting where the black letters tried to etch deeper. His veins glowed faintly red where Elias's blood had reached him, lines of crimson branching through the script like veins of defiance. The drowned figures began to tremble, some collapsing as if their ink was leaking away. They clawed at their own arms, unable to hold their form against the intrusion of blood. The faceless figure hissed, its body rippling. "You dare write yourselves upon my cathedral." Its ink blades crackled with jagged black light as it swung them through the air. Each strike sent shockwaves through the stone, pews shattering like kindling, chains whipping down from the ceiling, wrapping around Malachi's arms and throat, dragging him toward the altar. Elias felt the chains, too, tightening around his ribs. Though nothing touched him in the farmhouse, his breath crushed from his lungs. He could not scream, but still forced his arms deeper into the journal, up to the shoulder, until his chest leaned against the ink surface. "Not without you," he growled, his voice a strangled rasp. And then the pull shifted. The journal did not swallow him whole, but split wide, the ink rising like a tide around his body, folding him inward, and Elias vanished from the farmhouse, leaving behind only the broken table and a book still wet with his blood. The world convulsed as Elias's body slammed onto stone, not from falling but from being written into existence. He staggered forward, lungs searing, the air heavy with the stench of wet parchment and iron. Torches guttered high above, yet their flames bled black, and before him stretched the cathedral he had seen only in nightmares. Its pillars dripped with ink that never dried. Every carved saint was faceless, hands raised in warning or surrender, and at the center of it all knelt Malachi, chains cutting into his arms, the single letter carved in his chest, glowing faintly with Elias's blood. His head lifted weakly, eyes locking onto Elias, not with surprise, but with recognition, as though he had expected him all along. "Elias," Malachi rasped, voice shredded but unbroken. "You shouldn't have come." The chains jerked him back, scraping across the floor, blood trailing. Yet he smiled faintly, as if relieved that his suffering was no longer unseen. The faceless figure towered above the altar, its blades raised, its voice slithering. Two brothers written upon the same page cannot endure. One must be erased. Its body swelled, ink cascading like waterfalls from its limbs, flooding the floor until Elias's boots sank ankle-deep. The drowned figures rose again, their hollow mouths opening in silent chants. Elias stumbled forward, teeth gritted, his hand still stained from forcing through the journal. The blood on his fingers glowed brighter here. Each drop that fell onto the cathedral stones sizzled, spreading crimson veins through the ink that tried to swallow them. Every step left a mark, not of surrender, but defiance. Malachi twisted against his bonds, his skin burning where the script had claimed him. But Elias's presence fed him, the red lines threading deeper, resisting the black glyphs. And for the first time, Malachi's body fought back, chains sparking as if until. Sure which master held them, Elias reached him, grabbed the links, his palms blistering under their heat. "If this cathedral writes fates," he snarled, eyes on the faceless thing, "then it can choke on ours." His grip tore skin from his hands, but the links began to crack, thin red fissures spider-webbing through the black steel. The cathedral groaned, walls bending inward, ink dripping faster as if panicked. The faceless figure lunged, blades cutting through the air, and in that instant Elias pulled, Malachi braced, and the first chain shattered like glass under the force of blood meeting ink. The first chain's shatter rang like a bell, not of freedom but of defiance, and the sound rippled through the cathedral, shaking the ink rivers, cracking the pillars. The faceless figure recoiled as though struck, its blades dripping streams that hissed against the stone, yet it lunged again, faster, hungrier. Elias braced, muscles screaming, and Malachi surged forward with what little strength the broken chain granted. Together they pulled against the others, blood mixing with ink, red streaks burning like fire through the black glyphs that bound him. With each snap the cathedral wailed, its walls bowing inward as though the very architecture despised resistance. The drowned figures clawed out from the flood, shrieking soundlessly, their bodies collapsing into ash when Elias's blood splashed against them. Malachi wrenched his arm free, flesh torn raw, but he rose, his back bent, yet his eyes blazing. "You should have stayed away," he said again, but this time not in warning, in gratitude. The faceless figure's voice deepened, echoing from every wall. Ink cannot be undone, blood cannot rewrite the page. It raised both blades, its form splitting into dozens of duplicates, each one stepping forward, crowding the altar, yet Elias saw how their outlines bled, how they flickered as though uncertain. "Then we won't rewrite," Elias spat. "We'll burn the page." He pressed his bleeding palm against Malachi's, their hands clasping, crimson threads igniting between them. The cathedral shuddered violently, cracks racing across the ceiling, parchment peeling from the walls as if tearing itself apart. Malachi clenched his jaw, his body a map of carved letters, glowing red now instead of black. He lifted his free hand toward the advancing duplicates, and for the first time they recoiled, faltering, as though the script that owned him now betrayed its master. Together, the Brottos. Hers stepped forward, their shadows stretching long and jagged against the altar. Elias dragging chains behind him like weapons, Malachi wielding his own scars as sigils. The faceless thing screamed, blades swinging in arcs that split the air. But when they struck the ground, they shattered, spraying ink that hissed and dissolved into mist. The cathedral bent inward like a throat swallowing itself, torches bursting into red fire, the drowned choir disintegrating in waves, and as the last chain around Malachi cracked, both brothers stood unbound, surrounded by collapsing walls, united not by fate, but by defiance, ready to strike together. The cathedral convulsed like a living beast, pillars snapping, stained windows shattering inward, raining knives of red and black glass that dissolved into smoke before they touched the ground. The air burned with the stench of ink boiling away, of blood sizzling against stone. The faceless figure staggered as cracks opened across its body, lightless fissures pouring shadows, its form unraveling as though it had been stitched together only by obedience and fear. Elias dragged Malachi from the altar, both stumbling as the floor split open into chasms that revealed not earth, but an endless abyss of writhing parchment, each page scrawled with names that screamed in silence before crumbling into nothing. The cathedral was eating itself alive, and still the faceless thing clawed forward, one arm now gone, the other dragging a broken blade, its voice no longer commanding but pleading. The script must be obeyed. No blood burns forever. Malachi stood, chains falling from him like shed skin, his body raw with torn glyphs that bled both red and black. He looked at his brother, and for the first time in years, a faint trace of his old self flickered through his eyes. "Then let it end here," he whispered. "With us." The brothers clasped hands once more, their blood mingling, and the fire that erupted between their palms was not ordinary flame. It was defiance incarnate, a blaze that consumed the ink marks crawling across Malachi's body, rewriting nothing but erasing everything. They thrust their joined hands toward the faceless figure. The blaze struck it full force, igniting its hollow body. Its scream split the cathedral apart, the sound of 1,000 pages tearing at once. Its form crumbled into liquid shadow and then into dust, scattering into the void below. The cathedral roared, walls collapsing inward like the jaws of a beast biting down on itself, torches exploding, chains shattering in a storm of sparks. Elias and Malachi ran, leaping over cracks, dragged forward by instinct more than hope. The great doors, once shut forever, burst open in a torrent of black wind and fire. They stumbled into the night as the entire cathedral folded in on itself, vanishing into the earth with a thunderous silence. When the dust settled, nothing remained but a scar on the land, a circle of scorched ground and silence too heavy to bear. The black cathedral was gone, yet the brothers stood side by side, unchained, knowing some bindings had broken. But others, older and darker, might still linger unseen, waiting for ink to find another page.